The prairie had a silence to it that could never be mistaken for peace. It was the kind of silence that carried the weight of years, of wind scraping over dried grass, of coyotes calling in the distance, and of lives lived in quiet hardship. Out on the edge of the land, where the rolling hills bent into the shadow of the mountains, stood a small cabin. Weather-worn wood and a stone chimney told of winters survived and summers endured. The cabin belonged to a woman who had lived alone for so long that even the nearby townsfolk had stopped wondering about her. No one really knew her story in detail. Some said she had once come west with a husband and lost him to sickness. Others whispered about a child buried out back, though no marker was ever found. There were even those who claimed she had never belonged to anyone at all, that she had been born of hardship and would die in it. What they all agreed on was that she kept to herself. She traded for flour, salt, and lamp oil when she had to, but she never lingered in town. Her eyes were steady and her words were few, and when she rode away with her supplies, people let her go without questions. In truth, her solitude had become her shield. She had learned long ago that the heart could only take so much breaking before it grew quiet, almost numb. The cabin was her world, the land her companion. Every sunrise was greeted with chores, every sundown with silence. At night the wind whistled through the cracks of the cabin, and she listened, reminding herself she was still alive. Sometimes she thought of the years that had slipped away and wondered if she had chosen loneliness, or if loneliness had chosen her. The land around her had a history as old as the stones in the creek bed. It was Apache land, though most settlers pretended to forget it. Battles had been fought, treaties made and broken, and yet the spirit of the Apache people still lingered. She had seen them from a distance on rare occasions, proud riders against the horizon, watchful and wary. Some in town feared them, others hated them, but she had always felt something different. It was not fear or hatred, but a kind of recognition, as if they too understood what it meant to be bound to the land and to carry unspoken burdens. The nights grew colder as autumn deepened. She had stacked her firewood high and salted what meat she could spare. The mountains already wore a crown of snow, and the ground beneath the tall grass was hard with frost. Life in such a place taught a person to prepare, because winter could turn cruel in the blink of an eye. Yet nothing in her years of solitude had prepared her for what came one evening, when the last red light of day was fading into the blue shadows of night. She was at the hearth, mending a tear in her worn coat, when a sound broke the stillness. It was not the cry of a coyote or the snap of a branch. It was sharp, sudden, and deliberate. A knock at the door. Her hand froze on the needle. For a long moment she thought she had imagined it, but then it came again, low and steady. No one ever knocked on her door. Not travelers, not neighbors, not even townsfolk. Her cabin was too far off the beaten trail, too forgotten. She rose slowly, her fingers brushing against the worn handle of the rifle that leaned by the door. With her other hand, she pulled back the latch and opened the door, just enough to see who stood beyond. There, against the fading twilight, stood an Apache warrior. His dark hair fell loose over his shoulders, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. His clothes bore the wear of travel and hardship, and beside him, half hidden in the folds of his blanket, stood a young boy. The child's face was pale from the cold, his small hands clinging to the edge of his father's coat. For a heartbeat, none of them spoke. The woman studied them with a guarded stare, while the warrior's expression was unreadable, carved from the same stone as the land itself. Finally, in a voice deep and even, he spoke. "We need shelter." The words hung in the air, simple, yet heavy. She glanced at the boy, whose eyes, wide and dark, searched hers with a mixture of fear and hope. Something stirred in her chest, something she had long buried beneath layers of silence. But another part of her tightened with caution. This was Apache land, yes, but the wars between settlers and the tribes were not so far in the past that she could forget. She had heard the stories: raids, vengeance, loss. Could she trust them? Could they trust her? The warrior did not move closer. He stood firm, waiting as though the decision was hers alone. The boy shivered against the cold wind, and she saw the faint puff of his breath in the air. She thought of the nights she had braved alone in that cabin. The way the cold seeped into the bones, the way hunger sharpened into pain. She thought of how a child would suffer even more. Her hand tightened on the doorframe. She knew that if she let them in, her life of quiet solitude would be broken. There would be no turning back. Yet if she turned them away, she might carry the weight of it forever. Behind the warrior's steady gaze was something else, something more than pride. It was the same look she had once seen in the mirror on the hardest of days, a look that carried loss, endurance, and the will to keep going for the sake of someone else. The fire inside her cabin crackled, throwing its light onto the floorboards. The warmth stretched only a few feet beyond the door, but it was enough to show her how cold the boy's face had grown. The woman's heart beat louder than the wind outside. She had lived alone for many years, building walls around her soul to keep out the world. Now, on this night, those walls trembled. She hesitated, her mind caught between the comfort of her long solitude and the unknown that stood before her. The warrior's hand rested gently on the boy's shoulder, steadying him against the wind. The boy's eyes lifted once more, meeting hers, and in that small, silent glance, she felt something break open inside her. Still, she did not move, not yet. The night air crept in around the doorway, sharp and cold. The warrior waited. The boy shivered again, and the woman stood, her hand on the latch, knowing that the choice she made in that moment would change everything that followed. The silence stretched, heavy with questions that had no easy answers. Then the wind rose, rattling the cabin walls, and the sound of it carried like a warning through the dark. Her lips parted, but the words caught in her throat. She had lived alone for so many years, but now her quiet life hung in the balance. The door was half open, and the decision was hers to make. And just as she drew breath, ready to speak, the boy swayed on his feet, his knees buckling as if the strength had gone out of him entirely. The boy's sudden weakness pulled her forward before her mind had even settled on what to do. She dropped the rifle back against the wall and caught him as he sagged, his small frame light in her arms. His skin was icy, and she could feel the tremor running through him. Without another word, she pulled the door wide and stepped aside. The warrior guided the boy in with a quiet nod, his movements measured, as if entering a stranger's cabin required both humility and strength. The firelight threw their shadows long against the rough walls. The woman eased the boy down onto a chair near the hearth, tucking the blanket tighter around him. His dark eyes blinked dully at the warmth as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. The warrior stood near the door, silent, watchful. His presence filled the small space, though he said nothing more. She sensed he was giving her room to decide what came next. She poured water into a tin cup and handed it to the boy. He took it with shaking hands, his eyes lowering in quiet thanks. Then, after a long moment, she turned to the warrior. "How long have you been on the trail?" "Many days," he answered simply. His voice was deep, carrying the weight of miles traveled. He did not explain further, nor did she press. Something in his tone told her the answer was not as important as the reason. Still, questions swirled in her mind. Where had they come from? Why her cabin? And what danger might follow them here? The woman was no stranger to hardship, but she had built her life around avoiding the storms of others, and whether she liked it or not, she was inside theirs. She stoked the fire higher, letting its glow soften the room, then ladled a portion of stew from the pot she kept simmering. She handed it to the boy first, watching as he ate slowly, each bite deliberate, as though hunger had become a careful habit. The warrior declined when she offered him a bowl. "The child first," he said, and there was no mistaking the steel in his tone. She studied him in the firelight, noticing the lines cut deep around his eyes, the wear of sleepless nights. His clothes were worn but cared for, patched with skill. A bow and quiver rested across his back, and a knife was tied at his waist. This was not a man unprepared for hardship, yet even so, the boy's exhaustion had driven them to knock on her door. She set the second bowl aside but left it within his reach, then sat across from them. The boy's eyes began to lose their haze as the warmth and food settled into him. In that soft light, she saw not just weariness, but trust slowly growing. She had not felt such a thing in her cabin for many years, and it unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The warrior finally moved closer to the fire, lowering himself onto the edge of the hearthstone. The silence between them stretched, but it was not empty. It was the silence of two people measuring one another, sensing the weight of choices not yet spoken. At last she said, "There are not many who come this far from town, fewer still who knock." His gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "We had no choice. The land is not safe." Her stomach tightened at his words. She had heard murmurs in town of unrest, of broken agreements, and stolen cattle. Whispers of skirmishes flared and died as quickly as sparks, but none of the settlers wanted to speak too loudly of it. Now, with an Apache warrior and his son under her roof, those whispers carried new weight. The boy's breathing grew even, and before long his eyelids drooped shut. The warrior drew the blanket higher, his hand resting for a brief moment on the child's hair. The tenderness in that small motion unsettled her almost as much as his presence. She had spent so many years without such bonds that seeing one laid bare felt like a mirror she was unprepared to face. When she finally spoke again, her voice was low. "If trouble follows you here, it may come to my door as well." He nodded, accepting her words without flinch or apology. Yes. That simple honesty struck her harder than denial ever could have. He was not a man who begged, nor one who promised safety he could not keep. He had come because he had to, not because it was easy. And for reasons she could not explain, she felt a stirring of respect for him. The night wore on, the fire burning low. She gave him the second bowl of stew at last, and he ate it without complaint. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, reminding her how small her refuge truly was. She lay down on her narrow bed when sleep finally claimed her, but it came restlessly, filled with fragments of memory. She dreamed of her own loss, of cold nights when she had prayed for a hand to steady her, for a voice to tell her she was not alone. She dreamed of the child's wide eyes, and the way the warrior had stood silent but unyielding, as though carrying the weight of more than his own survival. Morning came gray and sharp, the first light cutting across the frozen land. When she rose, the warrior was already awake, standing near the door as though he had kept watch all night. The boy still slept, curled tightly under the blanket. She moved quietly, preparing coffee and a little cornbread. "You kept guard," she said, not so much a question as an observation. "Yes," he replied. "The land is not safe for us." There it was again, that warning threaded in every word. She wanted to demand the truth, to know what danger they had dragged to her doorstep, yet something in his face stopped her. He would tell her only what was necessary, and perhaps only when the time came. As they ate, the boy stirred, sitting up with a faint smile of relief at the warm cabin. His presence shifted the air, softening the edges of the warrior's stern demeanor. She found herself wondering about his mother, about the life they had left behind. But she held her questions. The day stretched long. She busied herself with her usual chores, mending, splitting wood, tending to her small store of supplies, but now every motion carried a different weight. 2 extra mouths meant her careful stores might not last the winter. A warrior beneath her roof meant rumors could spread if anyone found out. Yet beneath her worry, she felt something stirring she had not felt in years, the sense that her life was no longer bound only to silence. By evening, the boy was stronger, his cheeks warmer from the fire. He helped her carry water from the creek, his small steps determined. She watched the warrior watch his son, and the care in his eyes spoke louder than any words. It was then she realized how much the boy mattered to him. Whatever had driven them here, whatever danger stalked them, it all centered on keeping the child alive. That night, as the wind howled again, the woman lay awake staring at the shadows on the ceiling. She could feel the shift in her life as surely as she felt the cold pressing through the cabin walls. For years she had lived untouched by the troubles of others, safe within her own boundaries.
Ow!
With one knock at her door, the world had intruded. The warrior's words returned to her again and again. The land is not safe. She knew enough of history to understand what that might mean. Tensions between settlers and Apache had never truly ended, only settled into uneasy silence. If unrest had risen again, the man and his son could be hunted, perhaps already pursued. And if that was true, then her cabin might already be marked by their presence. The boy shifted in his sleep, murmuring softly, and she felt her heart twist with an ache she hadn't known in years. The choice to shelter them had not been made with reason, it had been made with instinct, with something buried deep that still remembered compassion. Yet compassion had a price, and she feared she was only beginning to glimpse what it might be. Outside, the wind carried faint sounds that made her rise from her bed. She moved to the window, pulling back the curtain. The moonlight lay pale over the prairie, and in the distance, shadows moved along the ridge. She held her breath, straining to see. Riders, maybe though too far to know for certain. Her chest tightened with a mix of fear and certainty. When she turned back, the warrior was already standing, his bow in hand, his eyes sharp and alert. He had seen it too. Their gazes met in the dim light of the cabin, and though no words were spoken, the truth between them was clear. Whatever silence she had lived in before was gone. Trouble was moving closer, and her cabin was no longer the place she had once believed safe. The shadows on the ridge disappeared before dawn, but the unease they left behind clung to the cabin walls. The woman moved through her morning chores with a knot in her chest, her hands steady, though her thoughts refused to quiet. She fed the fire, kneaded bread, and filled the kettle, all while glancing toward the door as if expecting it to be forced open at any moment. The warrior said nothing about the riders, but his silence spoke more than words could. His watchfulness grew sharper, his steps deliberate, his eyes scanning the land beyond the windows with the certainty of a man who knew danger when it lingered near. The boy seemed lighter that morning, his color returning with food and warmth. He followed her into the yard as she split kindling, his small hands trying to mimic her work with a stick he had found. She almost told him to stop, to save his strength, but the sight of him playing brought a softness she hadn't felt in years. The warrior's gaze never strayed far from his son, and though his face stayed stern, she could see the quiet relief that his boy still had enough life left to smile. Yet the land around them was not smiling. The stillness of the prairie held a weight, as though every sound might carry too far. When the wind lifted, she imagined the noise would be heard by ears she did not want listening. She tried to push the thought aside, but when she looked at the warrior standing in the yard, his bow slung across his shoulder, she knew her fears were not her own alone. Later, as she drew water from the creek, the warrior joined her. The boy remained near the cabin, tossing pebbles against a stump. She glanced at the man beside her, his shadow tall against the pale winter light. "You saw them too," she said quietly. "Yes," he answered. His voice carried no doubt. "Riders yours?" she asked, though she regretted it the moment the word slipped free. His eyes met hers, sharp and steady. "Not mine." The truth of it chilled her more than the wind off the creek. Whoever those riders were, they weren't his people. If they weren't his, then they might belong to settlers or soldiers. Both possibilities carried their own weight of danger. She did not press further, but as they walked back toward the cabin, her mind spun with questions. If the riders had seen the cabin's faint smoke, would they come closer? If they found an Apache warrior under her roof, what story would they carry back to town? What price would she pay for giving shelter? That evening, the boy curled by the fire, his eyes growing heavy as the warmth lulled him to sleep. The warrior sat across from her, silent, yet the tension between them filled the room. At last, she asked, "Why here? Why my door?" He stared at the fire for a long moment before answering. "Because you are alone?" The words cut deep. She wanted to ask how he knew, how he could sense the truth she had spent years hiding from others. But she did not. The way he spoke carried no malice. It was simply fact. He had chosen her door because no one would think to look here, because her solitude was its own form of shield. The boy stirred, and the warrior reached over, resting his hand against his son's shoulder until he settled again. His expression softened for that brief instant, then returned to its guarded stillness. She realized then that the boy was not just traveling with him, but the reason he was still moving at all. Over the next days, the rhythm of her cabin shifted. She had lived by her own pattern for years, but now the chores and silences were broken by the presence of others. The boy's laughter carried through the walls as he discovered small joys in simple things: a carved stick, the warmth of stew, the spark of firewood catching flame. The warrior said little, yet his presence was constant, moving with quiet strength through her space. But the peace inside the cabin was only a fragile layer stretched over something darker. Each night she thought of the riders on the ridge. She began to notice signs in the land, the faint prints of horses near the creek, the way birds startled into flight as if disturbed. One afternoon, while gathering wood, she found an old campfire buried beneath leaves, no more than a day old. Someone had been near. When she told the warrior, his face hardened. "They are watching," he said simply. Her hands trembled as she carried the wood inside, though she tried to hide it. She wanted to believe this was still her home, her quiet place apart from the world. But the truth was pressing closer each day. The warrior began teaching the boy small lessons each evening, their voices low near the fire. She listened without meaning to, catching fragments. The boy repeated words in his father's tongue, learned how to hold the bowstring, though too weak to pull it fully, and practiced the steady breathing of one who must listen to the land. Watching them stirred something she could not name: admiration, sorrow, and a quiet ache for the life she had lost. One night, as the fire burned low, she found herself asking the question she had avoided. Who are they, the riders? The warrior looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Men who take what is not theirs. Men who hunt what they fear. And they hunt you, she whispered. He nodded once. And the boy, her chest tightened at the thought. A child being hunted seemed cruel, even for a land that had seen so much cruelty. She wanted to ask why, wanted to know what crime could justify such pursuit, but she saw the shadow in his face and let the question die. The truth might be heavier than she was ready to carry. The next day, clouds rolled in, heavy with snow. The cabin became a world of its own, shut away from the prairie by a curtain of white. The boy pressed his face to the window, marveling at the falling flakes, while the warrior remained near the door, listening as if the storm itself might hide footsteps. The woman worked quietly, her mind restless with thoughts she could not settle. That night, as the storm howled, a noise cut through the wind. Faint at first, then sharper. The sound of hooves striking frozen ground. She froze where she stood, the bowl in her hand slipping against the table. The warrior's head lifted instantly, his eyes locking with hers. He had heard it too. The boy stirred from his place near the fire, confusion flickering in his sleepy gaze. The woman's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to believe it was just the wind carrying echoes, but the warrior's face told her otherwise. The sound came again, closer this time. The woman reached for the rifle by the door, her hands trembling against the wood. Had not fired it in years, but the weight of it was familiar. The warrior drew his bow, his movements swift but silent. The boy's eyes widened, fear creeping across his face as he pressed closer to his father. The cabin seemed smaller than ever, the walls closing in around them. The sound of horses circled nearer, muffled by snow but steady, deliberate. Someone was searching. The woman's breath caught as she glanced at the boy, his small frame trembling against the blanket. She thought of the years she had lived in silence, untouched by the struggles of others. That silence was gone now, shattered by a single knock on her door. The warrior's gaze met hers once more, and in his eyes she saw both warning and unspoken resolve. They were no longer just waiting out a storm. The storm had come to them. The sound of hooves stopped just beyond the ridge, too close to ignore, too close to pretend. The cabin walls shook with the weight of the wind, and inside 3 lives held their breath, waiting for what would come next. The storm pressed against the cabin like a living thing, rattling the shutters and sending flakes of snow spiraling through the cracks. Yet beneath the howl of the wind, the sound of horses lingered, too heavy, too measured, to be a trick of the storm. The woman held the rifle tight against her chest, her knuckles white from the grip. The warrior crouched near the door, his bow drawn, his eyes fixed on the faint glow of firelight that spilled across the floorboards. The boy huddled under the blanket, his wide eyes darting between the two of them, his small body shaking though he made no sound. The horses shifted outside, their hooves crunching through snow and ice. Then voices rose, muffled but close. She couldn't catch the words, but the tone was enough. Men, more than one. Their voices carried through the night with the ease of those who believed they had nothing to fear. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the storm itself. The warrior's hand lifted, steady and quiet, signaling her to stay still. He leaned closer to the door, listening, his face unreadable. She wanted to ask what he heard, what he knew, but the weight in his eyes kept her silent. Minutes stretched long, each second marked by the beat of her heart. The boy clung tighter to the blanket, his breath shallow, as if he too understood the danger pressing close. The voices grew clearer, though the words were still lost to the storm. Laughter cut through once, sharp and careless, followed by the crack of a whip striking the air. Her stomach turned. Whoever they weren't just passing through. They were searching. And if they came close enough to see the faint smoke from her chimney, they would find more than they bargained for. She glanced at the warrior, but he didn't move, didn't speak. His focus was absolute, every muscle in his body drawn tight. She realized then that this was not the first time he had been hunted. Not the first time he had stood between his child and danger. There was no panic in his face, only the stillness of someone who had survived too many nights like this one. The men outside fell quiet for a long stretch. Only the horses shifted, snorting against the cold. The silence pressed heavy against her chest, worse than the sound itself. She wondered if they were watching the cabin now, hidden in the storm, waiting for movement. At last, one voice carried over the wind, loud and certain. This time she caught enough to understand. Tracks, fresh ones. Her blood ran cold. He'd found the trail leading here. The warrior's jaw tightened, and his hand slipped to the knife at his belt. He turned his head just enough to look at her, and in that glance she saw both warning and choice. They might have only moments before the riders came closer. The woman's hands trembled against the rifle. She had lived alone for so long, surviving by keeping herself apart from the troubles of others. Yet here she was, with a boy sleeping under her roof, and a warrior ready to defend him. The silence of her years felt like a fragile shell, and now it cracked under the weight of what waited beyond the door. Snow pressed harder against the windows, dimming the light inside. The boy shifted, his eyes heavy with fear, and she knelt beside him, whispering, "Stay quiet." Her voice shook, but the boy nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. Outside, the crunch of boots broke through the storm, not hooves this time. Steps, men on foot, moving closer. The warrior rose, bow in hand, and placed himself between the boy and the door. Linga's presence filled the cabin, not with noise, but with unspoken strength. She stood beside him, the rifle heavy in her arms, her heart pounding so loud she wondered if the men outside could hear it. The footsteps drew nearer, then stopped. For a moment, all was still. Then a fist struck the door, hard enough to rattle it on its hinges. "Anyone inside?" The voice was sharp, commanding. The woman froze. She wanted to answer, to shout them away, but her throat locked. The warrior shook his head once, his eyes never leaving the door. The fist struck again, louder this time. "We know someone's here." "Open up," the boy whimpered, muffled by the blanket. She pressed her hand gently against his back, urging silence, her own body trembling with the effort to stay steady. The men outside muttered among themselves, their voices low. She couldn't catch the words, but she knew the decision was being made. Either they would leave, or they would force their way in. She prayed for the first, but the weight in her chest told her the second was coming. The warrior leaned closer to her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "If they come, you stay with the boy." His tone carried no room for argument. Still, she wanted to protest, to say that this was her home, that she would not stand idle while others fought within it. But the look in his eyes silenced her. This was not just about the cabin, it was about survival, and he carried the burden of it without hesitation. Another voice rose outside, mocking, cruel. "Smoke from the chimney. Someone's hiding. Open that door." The latch rattled under the pressure of hands pulling at it. The wood groaned, but the bar held. The woman clutched the rifle tighter, her breath coming quick and shallow. The boy buried his face against the blanket, his shoulders trembling. The warrior stood unmoving, bowstring drawn, his silhouette carved against the firelight. She realized he had already chosen his place. He would not give the boy up, not to these men, not to anyone. The storm outside howled, the snow swirling against the walls, but inside the cabin, time held still. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind against the shutters, carried the weight of what was about to happen. Another slam shook the door, then another. The bar cracked, splinters flying into the room. The boy let out a sharp cry before pressing his face deeper into the blanket. Her heart raced so fast, she could hardly breathe. The world she had built, the silence she had clung to for years, was unraveling in the span of a single night. She could feel it in her bones. This moment was leading to something she could not turn away from. The door shuddered again, the bar splintering under the force.
Ow.
Snow blew in through the widening cracks, scattering across the floor. The woman raised the rifle, the weight of it almost unbearable in her arms, but her eyes fixed on the door. The warrior's voice came low, steady, a whisper through the chaos. "Hold your ground." Outside, the voices grew louder, harsher. Boots struck the steps, heavy and certain. Then, with one final crash, the door gave way, the storm spilling into the cabin along with the shadows of men. The firelight flickered against steel, against faces hard with intent. The woman's breath caught in her throat. The boy whimpered under the blanket. The warrior lifted his bow, his arm steady as stone. The cabin, once her refuge, was no longer silent. It had become the place where everything would break. The storm rushed in with the men. Snow swirling through the shattered door, and for a heartbeat everything blurred into firelight, shadows, and noise. The woman's rifle shook in her hands, the boy whimpered under his blanket, and the warrior stood tall with his bow drawn, unflinching in the face of what had come. The first man through the doorway staggered as the warrior loosed an arrow. It struck true, sending him sprawling across the threshold. The others cursed, their boots pounding against the wood as they forced their way inside. The woman's finger tightened against the trigger, the sound of the shot cracking loud in the small room. Smoke filled the air, the smell sharp, and one of the intruders fell against the wall. The boy covered his ears, his small body trembling. She wanted to go to him, to pull him into her arms, but she could not move. Not yet. The danger was not past. The warrior moved with a precision born of survival. His bow gave way to his knife as the fight pressed too close for arrows. Every strike, every motion, carried not just skill but a father's determination to keep his child alive. The woman's heart pounded, fear surging through her, but her body moved as though guided by something deeper than thought. She reloaded, fired again, and the sound thundered through the cabin. At last the storm outside seemed louder than the men within. The fight was over. The cabin was left in silence, broken only by the crackling fire and the boy's ragged sobs. The woman lowered the rifle, her arms trembling. The warrior stood over the fallen, his chest heaving, his eyes fierce in the glow of the flames. For a long moment neither spoke. Then the woman moved to the boy, kneeling beside him, gathering him into her arms. His small frame clung to her as though she were the only solid thing left in a world that had turned to chaos. She held him tight, her own tears burning at the corners of her eyes. She had lived so long without anyone to hold, so long in silence, and now the weight of it broke inside her. The warrior sheathed his knife and knelt beside them, his hand resting gently on his son's back. His eyes met hers, and in that look, she understood. He had not chosen her door by chance. He had seen something in her, some strength she had buried but not lost. Together, they had faced what neither could have endured alone. When dawn came, the storm had passed. The land lay white and still, the ridge covered in snow that glistened beneath the weak winter sun. The cabin stood scarred but standing, its door broken, its peace shattered yet not destroyed. The woman stepped outside, the cold biting at her cheeks, and looked out over the prairie. For years it had seemed endless, empty, a reflection of her own solitude. Now it looked different. Dangerous, yes, but alive with meaning. They buried the fallen men on the far side of the ridge. The warrior worked in silence, his movements steady, while the woman carried water and tended to the boy. No words were spoken, but the air between them was heavy with unasked questions. Why had those men been hunting him? What story lay in the miles he had crossed before finding her door? She wanted to ask, but part of her already knew the truth would be hard. At last, as they stood by the graves, the warrior spoke. They feared us. They feared what they do not understand. They thought the boy was a prize to be taken. His voice was even, but the pain beneath it was sharp. But he is not theirs. He is my blood. My son. The woman's chest ached with the weight of his words. She understood, perhaps better than she wished, the cost of being hunted, of being left to carry a burden alone. She had carried her own for years in silence. Watching the warrior and his son, she realized she no longer had to. That night, as the fire burned low, the boy slept peacefully for the first time since arriving. The woman sat near the hearth, mending the torn blanket, while the warrior repaired what he could of the broken door. The cabin no longer felt like a prison of solitude. It had become something else, something fragile, yet stronger than before. In the days that followed, the snow deepened, making travel near impossible. The warrior and his son remained, their presence reshaping every rhythm of her life. The boy brought laughter back into the walls, chasing shadows with simple joys. The warrior brought a watchful calm, his quiet strength steady as stone. The woman found herself changing in ways she had not expected. She had once thought her heart too weary for company, too broken for ties. But each day with them, that belief fell further away. She began to share her own story, not all at once, but in small pieces. She spoke of the husband she had buried years ago, of the child she had lost to fever, of the silence that had followed. The warrior listened, his eyes steady, never interrupting. He offered no false comfort, no empty words, only presence. And in that presence, she found a healing she had not thought possible. In turn, he spoke of his people, of the battles fought and the homes lost. He spoke of carrying his son away from bloodshed, of finding no safe place where he could rest. He did not speak with bitterness, but with the weight of truth. The woman understood then why he had knocked on her door. It was not just for shelter from the cold, but for a chance to breathe, to let his son live without fear for a little while. As the weeks passed, the snow began to soften, melting under the early warmth of spring. The land stirred, the promise of life returning with each trickle of water through the creek. The boy grew stronger, his laughter brighter, his steps quicker. The warrior watched him with pride, though his eyes still carried the shadow of what lay beyond the cabin. At last, the day came when the warrior knew he could not stay. The world outside would not rest, and his people needed him. He told her this in the quiet of morning, his voice calm but heavy. She felt her chest tighten, the thought of the cabin falling silent again pressing hard against her heart. But she also understood. To keep the boy safe, they could not linger in one place. The warrior's path was not hers to shape. When they left, the woman stood in the doorway, the repaired wood firm beneath her hand. She watched as the warrior lifted his son onto the horse, their silhouettes strong against the rising sun. The boy waved back at her, his smile bright, his eyes carrying both gratitude and sorrow. The warrior met her gaze one last time. No words were spoken, but everything that needed saying was there. Respect, gratitude, a bond forged in fire and storm. She watched them ride across the prairie until they were only shadows against the horizon. The silence that returned to her cabin was not the same as before. It was not empty. It was full of memory, of laughter, of the weight of choices made. It was the silence of a heart no longer closed, but open to what had been and what might come. That night, as the stars spread wide across the dark sky, she sat by the fire and let the warmth sink deep into her bones. For years she had lived alone, her world bound by walls of wood and stone. Now she knew that even in solitude, she was not truly alone. She carried with her the boy's laughter, the warrior's strength, or the reminder that every knock on a door carried the power to change a life. The prairie stretched out before her, vast and unending, but no longer empty. It was alive with memory, with possibility. She had once believed her life would end in silence. Now she understood that even silence could carry echoes of love, of courage, and of a bond strong enough to outlast the storm. And so she lived on, not as the woman forgotten at the edge of the land, but as the one who had opened her door when it mattered most.